Welcome to my local yarn shop. This is Juju Knits, which is owned by my sweet friend Julie in Fort Worth, Texas, and she was kind enough to allow me to come here today on her day off to film this segment for you about yarn weights and what they mean. My name is Elisa with knittingfairy.com. I am a teacher of knitting and a designer and former shop owner. I'm really not sad to say I don't have a shop anymore, but I'm a big supporter of local yarn shops. And a friend of mine, Donna, asked me during a knit class to explain to her yarn weights, what they mean and what they're good for. And so I thought I would take a moment and do a little segment here so that you can get an idea. The first thing you should do is go to yarnstandards.com, which is the Craft Yarn Council of America, and they have a system of standard yarn weights, which has all of these little symbols 0 through 6, and they explain in terms that are somewhat clear. First thing you have to understand is that standard is not standard. These people are trying really hard to create an industry standard, but nobody is required to adhere to these standards. And so you need to understand the behind the scenes part of it. So they have taken the large idea of yarn and divided it into 6 categories by weight. And by weight, I mean the number of yards of yarn in 1 pound. And here again, that standards thing gets us all because there are pounds and there are kilograms. But we are in the United States of America and we do pounds. It's just the way it goes. And so therefore, they have taken our yarn and divided it up into 6 different categories. And the categories are lace, fingering, sport, DK, worsted, chunky, and bulky. The names come from all different kinds of crazy places. I think lace is pretty self-explanatory, and this is a sample of some lace weight yarn. What is lace weight? Lace weight has at least 2,600 yards in 1 pound. What does that mean? This 100-gram skein, which is the equivalent of a skein of worsted weight you might make an Afghan out of. This one skein is 783 yards. It's a lot of yarn. There is no upper limit to lace. It gets finer than this. They make a yarn called cobweb that is so fine. You can take an entire shawl and pass it through a wedding ring. That's some skinny yarn. The trick with lace weight, if you look at it, it's really, really skinny, but it's usually not knit into a dense fabric. It is not knit at what I call garment tension, so that the stitches are so close together that you can't see what you're wearing underneath it. Generally speaking, lace weight is something that is knit on a much larger needle than expected. So gauge isn't going to help you really determine the size of your lace weight and comparable lace weights. If you have a pattern that calls for a lace weight and it says your 100-gram skein should have 783 yards, this is good. But I have seen them that have 900 yards. I have seen them with 1,000 yards. You have to get one that has the same number of yards in a pound, or if you don't want to figure out how many pounds is 100 grams, look at a 100-gram skein. This one's 783. If this one has 1,000 yards, they're not comparable. Fingering weight yarn, and it's not fingerling, folks, they're not potatoes. Fingering weight yarn. Fingering weight yarn has between 1,900 and 2,400 yards in 1 pound. This is some beautiful hand-dyed fiber that Serenity fibers made specifically for juju knits. Isn't it yummy? I might have to take it home. This is labeled as a size 1 in the 0 to 6 category. Lace weight is a 0. This is a size 1. It is generally knit on small needles. So 0s through 3s, that's a pretty broad category. Usually 1s is about the bottom end of fingering weight. And it gets somewhere in the 7 to 8 stitches in 1 inch. So this is something that you would use for a very fine, tightly knit thing. Socks comes to mind, but we'll get to sock yarn. Sock yarn is not necessarily fingering weight. That's a different thing. But fingering weight yarn is somewhere from 1,900 to 2,400 yards in a pound. This is a 100-gram skein, and it has 463 yards. So this is even fine for a fingering weight, but it's still well within the boundaries. And I know it's confusing with the ounces and the grams business, but most of the yarn is not manufactured here in the United States, and they label it in kilograms and grams. And here we are Americans, and we blithely fix ourselves in one position and use whatever unit to make sense to us at the moment, and we make no apologies. Sport weight yarn. What is sport weight yarn? Sport weight yarn is between 1,200 and 1,800 yards in a pound. This is again a 100-gram skein, and this one has 344 yards. So it's heavier than my fingering weight. This one had 450-ish yards. This one has 344. They weigh the same amount. So it's thicker. This one is something that you would use for sweaters, baby things, you know, something in that I want to knit something fine, but I don't want to go overboard in the fineness category. Generally, on sport weight yarns, you're using between a size 3 and a size 5 needle, and it's getting somewhere in the neighborhood of 5.5 to 6.5 stitches in an inch. Sport weight yarn. DK weight is very similar to sport, very similar. DK is a British term. So again, the United States and Great Britain, we are two peoples divided by a common language. We often say the same thing, but we don't mean the same thing. So here in the United States, we had sport weight yarn, and they had knitting worsted, and they have DK. DK is something that is half the size of their knitting worsted. This yarn is 290 yards in 100 grams. So the sport weight, 350 yards, the DK, 290. Sport weight yarn, DK weight yarn is usually knit on a size 5 to a 7 needle versus the sport weight, which was a 3 to a 5. So it's slightly bigger in needle size. It's going to get you somewhere around that 5.5 to 5 stitches to the inch range. This one is 22 stitches is 4 inches. That's 5.5 stitches to the inch. DK weight yarn. This again is good for kids' things. It's fine without being too fine. It's good for baby blankets. It's an excellent weight for baby blankets. Sweaters, makes a nice sweater weight, even here in Texas. Okay, little power business going on here, but heat of Texas summers sometimes causes some blackouts and brownouts, and this is why I run off of battery power. Back to our yarn weight system, we left off with DK. We're now going to move to worsted weight. What is worsted weight yarn? Worsted weight is between 900 and 1,200 yards in 1 pound. So this yarn is a worsted weight yarn This skein has 210 yards in it. This is the DK one that had 290 yards. This one, 210. They weigh the same amount. So you can see this is thicker. This usually gets somewhere in that 4.5 to 5 stitches to the inch range. Usually on a 7 to a 9. I really feel like 9 is really, you have to have a heavy worsted to be going with a 9. But this on our number scales, not all yarn companies use it, but this one is labeled as a 4. So worsted weight. Worsted weight is something that people use for afghans and blankets, outerwear, sweaters, hats, scarves, mittens, that kind of stuff. It generally is considered to knit up fairly quickly, so it's an instant gratification. It's the beginning of the instant gratification. You don't pick up lace weight for instant gratification. This scratches a different kind of itch. But worsted weight is something that currently I'm shopping for an afghan for my grandson, worsted weight yarn. Next in our system is the size 5, which is chunky. This is a chunky weight yarn. Chunky weight yarn is usually between 3 to 4 stitches in an inch. This one is 3.5 stitches to the inch. This is a number 5 on our yarn weight scale. Chunky weight yarn is somewhere in that 800-900 yards in a pound. So this particular 100-gram skein has 136 yards. Compare that to our worsted weight, which is 1 step down. This one, 210 yards. This one, 136 yards. So you can imagine, even though these weigh the same amount, this one is much thicker. This one you would use on a 9 to an 11 needle. You can use this for outer sweaters, especially if you live somewhere where it's cold. It's not uncommon to use for hats, scarves, cowls, slippers, some blankets, but then they start to get pretty heavy. But right now, you know, that chunky, super chunky knitted stuff is all the rage. And then we get into the 6s. And 6 is the top of our scale, and they list this as bulky. Bulky. It has a bottom end to it. It's 600 yards or so in a pound. Maybe as much as 800, but 600. It goes up into the ridiculousness stage where you can get a single stitch in an inch. It's crazy. So these two yarns both fall into the bulky category, but can you see the difference? So this is Burley Spun, which is a brown sheep product. It has 132 yards in, this is an 8-ounce skein. So this is half of a pound. So our 1 4-ounce skein would have 65 yards or so. If we were going to be comparing, it would be half this size and 65 yards. This one is Serdar Gorgeous, and it's an ultra super chunky. This is where they have now entered the realm of make it up as you go, because there is no real category for ultra super chunky. They've just made this up. This one, let's see, this is 150 grams worth of yarn versus this one, which is 226 grams. This one is 55 yards. So doing the similar weight thing, this one is 150 grams and it has 55 yards. And this one is 226 grams, is 132 yards. So half of that in 113 grams is 4 ounces. And that would be about 66 yards. This one's a lot thicker. What do you use these for? Oftentimes they are used for accessories. So big chunky hats, super chunky mittens, a decorative throw. And let's talk for a second about decorative throw. This is not the Afghan that you give your grandchild to drag across the floor. This is not the Afghan that you give your dog to lay on, because this yarn is only loosely associated with any kind of twist. It is barely above what they would use for spinning roving for hand spinners to make yarn. It's just a bunch of fibers floating together in the same direction. It pills and fuzzes like nobody's business. It's super fluffy. It makes a great fluffy scarf. It's wonderful. It's not durable. Okay, those are our 6 categories of yarn weight. And I hope perhaps this has given you some idea of what you might be looking for and what you need to shop for when you go to the yarn shop.